I'd forgotten how monumentally incoherent and bad the RTE representatives were. Let's not forget, for all the humour and talk about flip flops and chocolate and everything else, the RTE won't go so far as to say misled, but misreported the salaries of the most high profile presenters in the country to the Oireachtas, which if had that been done by the ESB or Bord Gáis or any other semi-state, there would have been similar uproar. But then on top of that, we had the effect that any fiction writer would want, which was high-profile individuals whom everyone knew in their homes, and some of whom saw their careers ended with RTE, I suppose, to the empathy of some. Nevertheless, I think what has happened this year with that organisation will disallow it, I think, from ever returning to the preeminent position it had in Irish affairs. And politicians will delay decisions that are not easy to make, but ultimately I think something is going to be forced on them in the next 12 months.
All right.
When it comes to cutting that down to a rump organisation that offers some kind of public service that it doesn't quite do now.
Holly, did you watch the saga unfold? Did you follow it?
I did. I followed it. And I mean, it was kind of hard not to. It was everywhere. It was all over Twitter, or I don't think anyone's calling it X, but I suppose I'm still calling it Twitter. And yeah, I mean, I had to say I felt kind of bad for Ryan Tubridy as well in a way, because I think that there was just a lot of people who already had an anger and a dislike for him that just really kind of grabbed their pitchforks and joined, you know, the kind of mob against him. But at the same time, the whole thing was, I can't swear obviously, but it was a blank show, as you could say. And just, you know, I think it's a bit of a slap in the face as well during a cost of living crisis to see RTE spending as if we're in the Celtic Tiger on concert tickets, trips to Japan for the World Cup, flip-flops, when you can get flip-flops for like €2 and pennies. So the whole thing was probably just a slap in the face for people during a difficult time.
Yeah, it's over now, but the reverberations are still felt in the organisation with the deficit in the licence fee revenue and all of that, maybe forcing the politicians' hands, Kevin, in a way. Media, and I'm not just talking about broadcast media, but media generally might be funded because more and more money goes to the social media platforms, and it's going to be tough for to generate local content for local people who want to read and listen and see themselves reflected in their media.
Yeah, I mean, the controversy itself was a boon for politicians, because if you look back over the year, we've been kind of limited in the number of big political scandals we have. You know, we have things like Pascal Donoghue getting his posters put up as kind of one of the massive political scandals of the year, which in hindsight probably wasn't as big as we made it at the time. So the politicians enjoyed their summer of beating RTE representatives around the place. But now, as we face into 2024, you're right, Pat, they're going to have to make some serious decisions. Firstly, about how to reform the licence fees so that people start paying it again. We're into tens of millions in basically boycotted payments now. But it's also probably given extra, I suppose, in some ways, energy mightn't be the right word, but to buildings like the one we're in here now with Bauer Media House, where I work, looking at this going, RTE gets all this money, and this is what was going on with it. And this is how they were wooing commercial clients that we're all competing for advertising and all the rest of it, with flip-flops and rugby trips, that private media can't compete with. So I think Commission Naman is obviously expanding hugely. Maybe we won't get into the boringness of that in some ways, but there's a huge job done now between the regulation of social media, the advertising that's going to platforms like Google and Facebook, and then the question of, is it right that RTE has this sanctified position in Irish society that has always been said so many times? It was said, RTE cannot fail. But there's lots of media doing lots of good work. And I think sometimes the politicians forget that.
Well, it's going to force their hand anyway, because they can't keep dipping into the public coffers with another maybe 20 million next year and going beyond, perhaps even more.
Oh, the minister has no room for that anymore because they won't be thanked for it.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to Holly. The Dublin riots is something that you will always remember from 2023.
Definitely. I think it's still very fresh in people's minds, even just, the images that we saw of the Lewis on fire and, buses on fire. And I think obviously there's serious conversations that need to be had about the far right. And, few were kind of expected to see the capital descend into a violent hellscape during rush hour. And I mean, I was out in the Three Arena when it was happening, and it was terrifying to see on Twitter, you're like, how am I going to get home? How bad is this going to get? How much is this going to escalate? And, the far right aren't a harmless group of conspiracy nuts. These events were, the end of years of complacency towards the far right in Ireland, I think, from the government. There's a lot of people who've been flagging this. I think post-pandemic, there was a lot of antisocial behaviour that wasn't taken seriously enough. And the thing about them is they're almost like this army that are kind of ready to take instructions, and it's like, meet at the spire and we're going to do this. And people might laugh. And at the time, I probably would have thought this was never going to happen. But the thing about it is as well that I find I tweeted about it, and I kind of flagged that there was an Irish athlete saying Ireland, we're at war, and things like that. And, my tweet got over 2/3 of a million impressions. It started a huge conversation. And I mean, the majority of the replies were sane and agreeing with me. And I mean, I'm open for a debate. I don't need everyone to agree with me online, but I definitely had some people from the far right who weren't happy with what I was saying. And it's funny how quickly they found my Instagram. They were in my DMs. They were flooding my DMs with abuse. And they were writing comments under all my posts, trying to incite fear in me. And that's how they operate if they don't want people to speak out against them. But I mean, I'm not going to, obviously it's intimidating, particularly as a woman. And I regularly post online where I am, where I'm going, and that can be intimidating. But I think it's conversations we all need to have. And I think that people need to realise it's something to be taken so seriously.
Kevin, that question of the pandemic and things weren't dealt with properly during the pandemic, policing matters particularly. And it reminds me of the old philosophy, if you try to keep a building in good shape, someone breaks a window, you repair it immediately. If in a public park some yobs pull up a sapling that's going to be a tree if it's left alone, you have to replant straight away. But what happened with the pandemic, when certain people effectively took over the streets, they didn't try to take the streets back soon enough, to insist on law and order, to say no drinking in the streets. I know you're gasping for a pint, and I know you're confined to barracks, and now you can't go into a restaurant or a pub, but you can drink on the street.
No, my own experience of that is obviously our offices are on Talbot Street. We were all at home like everyone else during the pandemic. Talbot Street, already one of the worst streets for seeing open drug dealing, fighting. There's regularly videos that go viral. And I think what happened during the pandemic, all the businesses were effectively empty. The tourists were no longer coming in as they do to Connolly Station and Busaurus. And that area was completely, it was no man's land, basically. And I think since COVID, the people who arrived for bad reasons, if you like, have stayed. And the suits, if I can refer to the business people, if you like, and the tourists with their trolley bags haven't come back in the same number. So there isn't that dilution effect anymore. And the guards, for all the talk about visible policing, you can walk up and down Talbot Street most days and not meet a guard from Connolly Station to the Spire. So I think it's too sloganistic to say take back the streets, but there is definitely a sense that the streets got away from us, and what happened on the day of the riots was probably a combination of people thinking they had, as I think my colleague Adrian Reckler said at the time, a free hit on Dublin.
Yeah. John?
I'd agree with Kevin on one point and disagree with some of it. I'm a little older than Kevin. I went to school in Belvedere College on North Denmark Street, very near where these riots began. Now, I walked up along Talbot Street, up Gardner Street, through rubble. There was nothing there. The whole place had been levelled. The old tenements had been knocked down. No new development had occurred. There was open drug dealing then of a more serious nature, I felt. There was, though, as Kevin said, a dilution of people going about their business on a very busy shopping street that was Talbot Street and other areas around there. There has always been social unrest in that part of the city. But what there used to be, in my experience, and I worked there, I lived there, I went to school there, was proper policing. Now, let's not forget, even though Sinn Féin made a political mistake in putting down a motion of confidence in the Minister for Justice, they didn't mind put down a motion of confidence in the no confidence in the Garda Commissioner, having already expressed no confidence in him. They were right to point out there was a major failing in policing that day. I was outside Leinster House and locked in Leinster House the day of the similar behaviour in September. And the Gardaí, I've spoken to many of them, the GRA have backed this thesis. The Gardaí are afraid and fearful of taking on crowds of protesters for fear of being facing disciplinary action within their force and by GSOC.
And then the weight they have before their suspension may be in most cases lifted.
Yeah.
But they're under suspension, under threat, and maybe there's a bad mark against them
2
somewhere
years
on their CV when they're going for promotion.
2 years of your life. So yes, social problems are there. Yes, right-wing ideology played some kind of role in this. But let's start at the start. Let's police our streets properly. Let's give the Gardaí proper resources. They're undermanned. And a significant shift, I thought, with the Garda Commissioner was one of the committee hearings. He said, if you remember down the years, they've always said, no, I'm properly resourced. Yeah. The Garda Commissioner did concede that there are not enough Gardaí. And the GRA and other bodies have said, we are not... our members are fearful of taking sufficient action against these people. And I witnessed it myself in September, and I was in town in November, and that was the problem.
Everyone has a camera now because they've got a mobile phone, and therefore the Gardaí are afraid, a judiciously edited piece of video goes viral, and that guard is pilloried, and who knows what was said on the other side. Do you know what I mean? They never show their own bad behaviour.
Once the narrative is set, it's very hard to change it.
And so, Kevin, your main event of the year, and it's tragically ongoing, Israel.
Yeah, I think October 7 will go down in history as a day we'll always be talking about for decades to come because of what happened in Israel and then afterwards what followed in Gaza. And I think it's been very interesting to watch it from an Irish perspective because we're a very small player on the global scene, but we were a total outlier at the start of this because from day one, Irish politicians and I think the Irish public at large were warning, careful what happens here next. And at the time, there was a lot of pushback internationally, and it has proven right now as we see America hasn't come all the way to the Irish view, but most other countries in the world are now of the Irish view, which is that Israel is going too far in its retaliation.
One of the things that the Israelis did after a while was to release video taken from the body cams of dead Hamas people, and they invited journalists. I didn't go.
I did.
You went to see it, John, and horrific stuff, the stuff of nightmares. But if you do the simple mathematics, it would be the equivalent of 800 people, for the same population, 800 people here being killed by terrorists on one day. And that might give people a sense of how would we feel if 800 of our citizens were butchered in one day and maybe another couple of hundred kidnapped.
Yeah, and we don't hear enough of Israel's side of things here. Let's not forget what happened there. War has broken out in the Middle East. I don't think it's responsible of any journalist, meaning myself, to start giving equivalence to any side of it and saying, Israel are doing what they're doing. Israel has felt and feels isolated in the Middle East. It is still a democracy.
But there is the question of proportionality, and that seems to have gone way out of kilter.
And I will say, even friends of Israel now are urging them not to become an international pariah by continuing what they're doing in Gaza. And I think sensible heads in Israel may come round to that point of view.
Holly?
I mean, I have to agree. It's obviously harrowing to watch, and I can't believe we're still here, that the weeks pass and there's still more and more footage of bombings and children and hospitals. And I mean, it's a difficult one as well to know what to say about it, because I do feel nervous, but you also have to use your voice as well. And I shared something online about, for the Palestinian people. And then I got a message of a friend who's Israeli living in Israel, and she was giving me her point of view and how she felt. And I just felt terrible for her. And it's just horrific that there hasn't been a ceasefire. And I think that I have massive respect for Holly Cairns, the politician who's demanding that and putting pressure on the government, because the more time that passes, the more lives that are being obviously lost.
I think part of the problem with our political discourse now, though, is that you can't have a moderate view where you take both sides and you try to balance them out, because I don't know if it's a symptom of Trump or Brexit or what it is, but one of the most striking things about this entire passage of the last couple of months is that you're not allowed to say that what happened on October 7th was terrible, but what Israel is doing is terrible too. That's seen as you're sympathising with the wrong side. So there is this idea that you can't actually be balanced on this particular topic. For whatever reason, people just feel so strongly about it that you can't. But the one thing I would say, Pat, is like we go into Christmas week. I was in Gaza in 2015 after Operation Edge, which had hundreds of deaths that time. But meeting the kids, and it is really, I think it's the really saddest thing going into Christmas week. When I was there, met loads of kids. There's a huge population of children in Gaza. They were all pretending to be Messi playing football on the streets, and they were all looking for Princess Elsa and pretending to be Princess Elsa. They're exactly the same as the kids in every house in Ireland looking forward to Santi this week, except Santi is so far off their agenda.
Yeah, it's hard to see what lies ahead for them because much of the infrastructure in which they lived, were educated, were fed, were treated medically, it's gone.
Yeah. And I saw that when I was there as well, because a lot of what Israel says about Hamas is true too. I visited a UN water factory where it was to try and clean the water, and there was a Hamas training camp being set up right beside it for that exact reason. I don't know whether that's still there or not, but the facilities are gone, and they were very bad to start with. So what happens to Gaza when this war ends, like all wars eventually do? It's very hard to see how it's a sustainable environment. Already the UN were saying it wouldn't be sustainable even if this hadn't happened.
You've got two sides, John, where you've got Hamas, whose ambition declared is to eliminate Israel from the Middle East, and you've got the Israelis who are declared to eliminate Hamas, which may be impossible. If Hamas goes, there will be son of Hamas, Hamas 2, basically recruited from the ashes of this conflict.
I think what you outlined there is correct and would also seem hopeless, but there is never no hope when it comes to peace. Now, the first problem is that Hamas is a prescribed terrorist organisation on the level of ISIS. It is not the group that carried out the actions that I saw about a month ago. You will not be able to negotiate with them. At one point in that video, there was a man rang his mother. We were shown, to tell your listeners, unedited coverage of videos and radio communications between Hamas. And one guy rang his mother and father from Israel, and he said, Dad, I just killed 10 Jews with my bare hands. Not mentioning that he'd used an AK-47, of course. Put Mom on, and she was on, and the three of them were crying with happiness on the radio at his great achievement. Your son is a hero. And one was left with hopelessness upon hearing that. But there is hope. Saudi Arabia, even Iran, had been coming somewhat towards Israel in discussion. And naive as it may seem, America and everybody else would be far better off in trying to get peace from this horrific, almost hopeless situation. But as we showed in Northern Ireland here ourselves, Bertie Ahern, Jerry Adams, David Trimble could bring peace to what seemed a hopeless situation.
But it took a long, long time.
It did.
I mean, we had our troubles, so-called. We tend to have these names like we had the emergency for World War II, the troubles for a 30-year-long conflict. It took that long and so many efforts at winning peace. How long this one will take, many people believe it's not for solution.
And the truth is, if Israel opened the border today to let people flee Gaza, there would be suicide bombers in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem by nightfall. That's the truth. So it does seem intractable.
Look, we will leave it there. Holly Carpenter, thank you very much, and a happy Christmas to you. Thank you for joining us. Kevin Doyle, who's Group Head of News at Media House, Executive Editor of The Independent. Thank you very much, and a happy Christmas to you, Kevin. And John Lee, Executive Editor of the Daily Mail Group Ireland. Happy Christmas to you, John, and thank you.
Happy Christmas.